Sejam bem-vindos a mais um episódio do Polaris Podcast. Hoje conversamos com um convidado muito especial. Temos o prazer de receber Regis McKenna, autor de diversos best-sellers e que trabalhou por muitos anos ao lado de Steve Jobs. Eu sou Conrado Abreu e comigo estão André Pastina e Rodrigo Rocha.
So, Regis, first of all, I really would like to thank you to be with us today. I think it's a great pleasure, and I think it's a great experience to everybody to talk to someone like you. So before I start, I just want to highlight here that how much I learned during my career with you. All the interactions that we had, I really learned a lot, and I'm sure that everybody here is gonna learn as well all your history and experience with the folks. So just to start from the beginning, Regis,
okay.
Can you tell how you start your career and decided to launch a marketing and a PR firm in your career? I think that's a good start for our audience to start to understand where everything started.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this many times. Looking forward, it's very hard to kind of see a path many times when you're particularly a young person. Particularly how I got started, I was sort of thrown into it rather than, it discovered me rather than me discover it. And that turns out that I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I actually had been going to school, been actually going to graduate school, and I was sort of a perennial student. I took a lot of different kinds of classes, and really immersed myself in them quite deeply, and really liked the idea of having a lot of different kinds of experiences back then. And so when I look at it forward, it would have been hard to see any clear path. But when you look at it from, let's say, a viewpoint now of having done this for well over 60 years, things become much clearer. And what it is that so much of everything you do adds knowledge, adds breadth, adds experience, and adds depth to what you are going to be. And it seems to me that one of the things that by the way, I sent you my oral history, and it starts out with the first chapter on my personal background. What happened as I was a kid and experiences as a child in Pittsburgh growing up. It sounds like I was from a city, but in fact it was somewhat of a rural area, and so it was sort of part city, part rural, and my experiences, particularly because I had 6 older brothers, and I was the only, I was the 6th brother. I had one younger, and no girls. By the time the 6th one come along, and certainly the 7th, you're sort of ignored. There's so much. It's become so routine in the family that to have boys and to have them pursue their activities and sports and so forth, that you really didn't think too much about it. But in fact, it was all preparing you for something later on. And that's, what I found was, and I talk about this in that book, is that it allowed me to experience a great deal of personal freedom. And that was within a family that had a lot of, my father was fairly strict and, strict rules. But for me, I found a tremendous amount of freedom because I could sort of go out and explore the world on my own very, very early. And it may sound weird, but when I was 4 or 5, I was out wandering in the woods and wandering in the neighborhood and wandering everywhere I could. And it seems to me that enjoying that freedom was something that certainly it gave me enough experience to say, or confidence to say, I can do this on my own. And have. I mean, I've continued to, let's say, I used to like to hike as a kid out along railroad tracks or into the woods or places like that. And certainly I enjoyed that as I got older. I took many, trips through the Sierras, through the Rocky Mountains, through Europe, through other places, through Canada, Alaska, British Columbia, doing photography. And so those experiences really, again, are things that develop your eye, develop your sight, develop the perspective that you have on the world. Now, how I got started was I was, I was going to school. I got an offer of a job to work for a publisher. It was an electronics publisher that published about 5 or 6 electronic magazines, and they published books and so forth. And they wanted someone to work for the publisher to kind of be his assistant and to learn the ropes of publishing. And so, I started fairly early, at the side of Mr. Rimback, who was the publisher and founder of these technical magazines. He was a very bright guy, very smart. These were what eventually went on to become automation technologies that they focused on. So, and in fact, he is considered the founder of the Automation Society, which became artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so very early in my career, even without having to know all the technology of it, I was exposed to that area. And so he thought, I got along very well with him. I went to Philadelphia for a brief training course in sales. And while we were there, I got a call from on a Sunday afternoon, and he asked if I would like to move to California. And we were just married. I had one child, little baby boy. My wife was there, and I covered the phone up with my hand, and I said, "Dianne, would you like to move to California?" And she'd never been outside of Pennsylvania, and I hadn't, for that matter, very much either. And she said, "Why not?" So a couple of weeks later, we were on a plane to California. I opened a publishing office out here on the West Coast, and that enabled me to, because it was electronics, it enabled me to call on all the technology companies out here. And so I formed the habit of just, going to all of these sort of potential sources of customers or advertisers and spending time with them, asking questions, getting their literature, researching who they were and what they made and who their competition was. And so I tried to always go in with something unique and different, rather than simply selling them a program in our magazines. That lasted about 1.5 years, and it got pretty boring to me. And I took a job at a small ad agency. In this ad agency, I introduced a concept of charging a fee rather than using commissions. As you may know, most ad agencies operate on commissions. They got a percentage of their advertising, but I figured that these companies needed a lot more than advertising. They really put too much trust in advertising and not enough in building an infrastructure for a real marketing company. And so I thought, to do that, I needed to really charge people a fee for handling, sort of being their internal marketing department. And there were a lot of startups here in the Valley, and that turned out very well. It was very successful. I was 21 years old when I did that. We did well. I was then brought in as a member of the marketing team of a company called General Microelectronics. This was a small semiconductor company. It was a spin-off of Fairchild. They were the ones to first develop a technology called MOS, metal on silicon, and that was the technology that eventually led to the development of the microprocessor and high-density memory. It was a technology that Intel later on adopted to allow them to build their first microprocessors and their first memories. It was, and so that gave me a lot of experience in bringing these new products to market. First of all, the first product that I brought to market was a single transistor. GME was also making transistors at that time. Everybody was, in fact. A transistor is about the size of a small, nail that you would put in the wall for a small light picture. It had a little head on it, and inside that head was a silicon chip. That transistor, people bought literally by the millions. And the first rocket ships to space and to the moon were all built out of transistors. But the MOS came along. The military wanted to reduce the weight, particularly the U.S. military. The U.S. military couldn't put a heavy rocket into space. They just didn't have the power in their engines, rockets. So they needed to build lighter computers, lighter equipment to be on board the rocket. And that really was developed with MOS technology. And so as I got more and more into this GME, I got more and more involved in those kind of programs. And I ran a huge technical writing group. And I had secret clearance, and we did proposals to the Air Force and the Navy and the Department of Defense and so forth for building, rockets and various types of technologies around MOS. That company was bought by a company called Philco. Philco was a very large East Coast semiconductor company. I didn't like working for Philco. They were big, cumbersome, bureaucratic, and it was top-down management. And I didn't like that. At that time, I was recruited by Don Valentine, who was the director of marketing at a brand new startup called National Semiconductor. And it was exactly on the same street, across the street. I didn't even have to change parking spaces. I just kind of walked across the street and started my new job. And this was starting from zero. And over a period of about 3 years, we built it to about $80 million, which in 1965 was pretty good. That experience with GME was sort of my MBA. I learned everything there was to know about chips, silicon, how they develop, how you use them, how they're applied, because I had a team of people that were doing the marketing, writing the spec sheets, working with the engineering department. And at GME, the company's small enough to where you get to know everybody, and you get to be able to know, every station along the way. And that was a company that not only made the devices, the silicon chips, they made ingots out of silicon that they grew out of molten silicon. And you could go to one end of the plant and watch them actually grow these crystals of silicon, and then watch them slice them, polish them, and then take them through the camera process of building the circuitry up on the surface, and then going into the fusion layers, which was a process that you embed various types of chemicals into the diffusioned areas of the chip that create the electrical characteristics. And so, getting involved in that was for me an education. Every day was an education. When I got to national, that was actually a much better kind of environment for me. National was run by people who basically were the people running Fairchild. Don Valentine was director of marketing there. Charlie Spork, who was the founder and president, was the general manager. He ran all the operations. And then the head of engineering was Pierre Lamond, and he was the head of engineering at Fairchild. So these people had, real professional background and experience. Don Valentine, who was a tough boss, and most people kind of feared him. But I went to work for him. I was the third guy in marketing at National, and Don gave me a tremendous amount of freedom. He basically said, I don't want you sitting behind your desk. I want you out into the marketplace. I want you talking to customers. I want you talking to distributors and realtors and people who, people who we work with in the field, and get it directly to customers and get to know the customers. And so I spent probably more than half of my time traveling the world during the 3.5, 4 years I was there, learning about how to apply these technologies in various circumstances. You had asked the question how Apple got to how I got the Apple account. The Intel account came first. It came almost 10 years earlier than Apple. And of course, it was the microprocessor that created Apple. If it wasn't for the microprocessor, you wouldn't have Apple. And so Steve had called Intel and asked them who does their outside marketing, and they introduced them to me, and that's how we got started. Any questions? You want to go so far?
I would just like to jump in first that I found it really interesting that you mentioned the freedom when you were a kid and all of this beautiful story. And I was wondering, have you always been confident that things would work out during this process?
Yes. No, sometimes people called me stupid, but I don't know. I always had when things got really bad, and my wife can even tell you this. She would ask me, "What do you do?" And I said, "You put one foot in front of the other, just keep going, and until you get it solved." And that came from just actually learning from a lot of really, really talented people, and then getting on your own. I can't tell you how many hours or weeks or days I spent, for example, traveling through every country in Europe and Asia, just meeting with people, talking to people, going on my own. And I was doing it on my own. Didn't have teams of people with me. But then once I got there, for example, with Intel, they had a European operation, and I got to know those people very, very well. And some of those people who were at Intel actually joined Apple later on. So, it's a much smaller world when you get inside these sort of highly specialized technical area. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows the companies in the business, and which people are talented and which aren't. So it may sound like a confusing world, but quite frankly, it's to me it's a compact way of educating oneself, assuming that you have an insatiable attitude or amplitude for exploring new things.
Awesome.
Regis, how was the challenge to educate the market to something new that was coming? I mean, the Apple personal computer for instance.
Yeah, well, one of the questions was about that was this whole idea of how do you sell something first time. And I think my company over, whether it's 50, 60 years, we introduced more first-time technologies. I mean, the list is about 20 to 30 different truly innovative products that didn't exist before. And when you think about it, the personal computer did not exist before. There was nothing quite like it on the marketplace. People compared it to, stereo equipment. It wasn't a stereo equipment. You didn't have to learn how to use a stereo equipment. It wasn't a TV set. You just pushed a button and it was on. The early computers, particularly the Apple II, it really did require you to have some basic skills and knowledge, and to do a bit of programming. And that required, I think, a demonstration. It was sort of, if you gave people a reference to something, it's like a radio. Well, what is it? Well, it's a Sony compact radio. Well, yes, but it's still a radio, and you still could figure it out. And there still was only a few knobs and buttons on it. But the microprocessor was a whole different engine, and the difference was this, and it was significant. It changed the world, literally. The microprocessor required something. The engineers designed products by building circuit cards. They would first lay out a schematic, electrical diagram, and then a schematic of what that would look like if you laid it out on a circuit card. They draw those, and then they go about finding the components they want, transistors, resistors, and so forth, and capacitors and other types of devices that you put on that circuit card to make a functioning subsystem. And the microprocessor was different. You didn't pick components at all. It was software. You programmed it. So engineers had to go from actually figuring out what components to use to actually learning programming. And that significantly changed. Now think about that. If you had to sit at a workbench with technicians helping you reconstruct circuit card after circuit card after circuit card, when one didn't work or one failed or whatever, you kept rebuilding it, or sit down at a computer and type out the software and then run it through a simulator and see what you've got. It's a much different process, and it means that products come to market faster. They come to market cheaper. You don't need tons of people to build it because it's all programmable. You can change it on the fly. You can change it when it's in the field. This is why you constantly are upgrading your computer. You're not taking it in to have it redone. That was a revolution, and it really changed the way people make products, particularly technology products, and that is really why the microprocessor took off. Was the way in which it processed data. Now that was really significant, and of course then Intel also had the first memory chip. They had the first electrically programmable chip memory. Intel was one of the most prolific technical companies I've ever seen. We would do hundreds of products a year for them, hundreds of projects. And I don't know how many people we had, but at one point we probably had 20 or 30 people working on Intel around the world. Wow. And what was nice about Intel is that they treated us like part of their team. They didn't, they didn't see us as vendors. They didn't see us as outside people. They saw us as part of the team. And in fact, when Andy Grove selected his teams, for example, they had a crush program in 1979 that was set out to essentially be superior to Motorola's microprocessor chips. we helped head up that program, and I was the only outside non-Intel employee to sit on the management of that board. And so they included us in very key kind of positions in the company. I think that's extremely rare for sort of a marketing company to come in and have those positions. Still doesn't happen today. They generally are considered vendors. Apple did the same thing. When Steve Jobs came in to see me, I did have some problems with he and Wozniak. I actually threw them out the first time they came in. Wozniak had an article that he wanted to get published in Byte magazine, and it was a very technical article, and I thought that it had to be less technical and more to the common person, and told him I had to rewrite his article, and he didn't like that. So I told him, and technical people don't want anybody touching anything that they do, and yet they're lousy writers.
Right.
I mean, they're terrible writers, but on the other hand, they want to write, so Steve called me back after they left, and Steve and I got along very, very well. And I said, you're not going to, you're not going to be successful unless you put together a whole program, and that involves every aspect of the company. And Steve liked that, and we set about doing that, and it ended up, Apple is truly a marketing company today.
That's true, and that's a great link for my next question. I know how much you were behind from the creation of the logo as well, the Apple that we know today. Can you tell a little bit about the story behind that?
Yeah,
how that come?
When Apple started, we thought they had to revise everything, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that at the time. And if you thought about it, in the late 1970s, this was in 76 and 77, 1976 and 77. If you thought of a computer company, you thought of IBM. And IBM was sort of, the sort of master of that race of people, the computer people. And they all wore white shirts, the same ties, very buttoned down suits. The company had a very cold, sort of almost granite, block lettered IBM. And then I started asking people if they knew the president of IBM or the president of any of these computer companies, and no one knew who they were, and no one even knew much about the company. But it turns out at that time, Tom Peters had written a book, In Search of Excellence. And what had happened is that most of the American consumer electronic companies had died. They had been essentially defeated by the Asian technology companies, Sony and others, who came out with just better products and cheaper products. And so most of those companies, a lot of them had started here in the United States. But there was a company called Ampex that made the first tape recorders and tape drives, big company here in California. And that company essentially, the Japanese copied their patents and essentially took over that business. So companies were dying that tried to take on any kind of global role, competing with lower cost Asian manufacturers. But what is essentially that meant that you had to build products that were not only better and cheaper, but essentially created a premium by being better. So to create this sort of story, which is what we did, the story was two college dropouts. When all of the other people, you go to IBM, everybody's a PhD in something. Every one of them are from Harvard, Yale, Wharton, the big schools, and here are two young kids that are essentially starting a new company, and nobody quite knew what a personal computer was at the time. But quite frankly, we spent an enormous amount of time educating the educators. I hired a bunch of technical writers. We would sort of farm those writers out to Intel and Apple, and in fact we had 60, 70 clients. So to write articles for those clients. Remember, this was an era when they didn't have the internet. They didn't have electronic communications. You read magazines, right. and the engineers read magazines to see how they should design things. And so you had to essentially write these articles time after time explaining what the benefit was, how to use them, and so forth. And you had to have actually a lot of workshops across the country. Trade shows, workshops. We set up rooms filled with Apple computers and had people come in and sit at those computers and would train them how to use them. Doing that, it sounds like it's time consuming, but you have no other choice, because if you have something that you've never seen before and don't know what it's used for, you've got to learn what it is and what benefit it can be. I mean, and so, most people relied on other people to give them advice. The most common question asked during the early 80s was, what personal computer should I buy? Everybody would ask other friends of that. And so it became a reference product, and a reference product meant that they needed more security to buy it than to simply buy it, over the counter, or to buy it from an ad. They both basically bought it from friends that had recommended it, from articles they read in detail how to use it, and how to implement it. And that was also in the microprocessor in the PC changed. They changed for example, every editor now had a PC at his desk. And so they started using them. And that's the first time, because most editors couldn't, you could show them a chip, and that was kind of interesting. It's a little, you'd drop it on the floor and you'd lose it. It was one of these things that didn't really have much to demonstrate. But when you put a personal computer on their desk and you show them how to use it, suddenly it all starts making sense. And so many of today's pundits in the computer industry and on magazines are former editors. I know one who was a sports editor. He's now the electronic editor. They became experts because they became, right? Once they had it on their desk, now they become experts. And so they, instead of us asking them for what people should do, they started essentially telling people what they should do. And but that means you have to stay very close to the media. Another thing I did was to get to know the media really, really well. I spent, again, so much of my time in New York City. I would go back there on my own. I spent my own nickel. I would go visit all these editors. I took them to lunch, took them to dinner, spent time at their homes, got to know their families. We went to plays together. And I can tell you that the Wall Street Journal, the editor of the Wall Street Journal, used to even invite me into his inner circles where the news people decided what stories they were going to pick for the next day. And so I got to know these guys so well that they would call me for advice, knowing that I wouldn't, that I wouldn't take that out of line. But that took years of development, years of friendship, years of relationship building.
Right.
And it really paid off. I think my business was and its clients. We had 6 Time magazine covers. We had 60 Business Week covers. I mean, we really had successes after success in terms of our clients getting attention and getting the front page on news.
Right. So, and just as a consequence of this, I know it's more like curiosity as well. On the advertising that you guys did in 1984, that is a great movie that you guys did that shocked the world. And you mentioned about the way IBM used to work. Everybody using the same type of a jacket, tie, and everything. But Apple was totally different.
That ad was done by Jay Chiat. It was Chiat Day was the name of the ad agency. They were in Los Angeles. Jay Chiat was a super creative, erudite sort of person, very successful. He was, when I was at National and GME, I hired him as my agency. So Jay became a very close friend of mine. And when I started my business, I used to actually show him, all the work we were doing and get his feedback, 3 or 4 times a year. And so Jay and I remained good friends. We remained, we co-invested in tech companies together. So he was a very, very good friend of mine. Now, what happened as we went along, it becomes very, very hard in a place like Palo Alto, where we were located. It's not the mecca of advertising. It's certainly the mecca for software and engineering. And if you want technical people, it's easy to find. If you want a creative director, if you want people who know how to put together commercials for video, for television, those people were all in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and London.
Right.
And Jay Chiat opened offices in New York and London, as well as Los Angeles. And so when I found that it was so hard to find these people, plus, we did a tremendous amount of training at our company, much like HSM, did a lot of training. We did a tremendous amount of training of our people. And of course, by the time they got trained, Silicon Valley is a pirate's location where they love to steal talented people. And most companies like Cisco and Intel and others, they could hire people away from you by doubling their salaries. They would hire them away by giving them huge stock options. Mm-hmm. As a private company, we couldn't do that. We couldn't pay them more than other people because that would not be fair, and we certainly couldn't. We didn't have. Basically, it was a privately held company, so we didn't have the same thing as a stock option, and we wouldn't go public, at least not for many years forward. So I talked to Jay about this actually. And we met actually at an airport and had conversations about it. And he said, "So what if we merge?" So we were going to merge, and decided to do that. But there was enough consulting business that we had developed. We had developed quite a sizable consulting operation as well as the graphics department. So I said, "No, I'm going to sell you the graphics group," which is what I did, and I'm going to keep the rest. And so we did that, and Jay and I remained very close friends. We continued to invest together, and we actually were on boards together. So he passed away, unfortunately, about 7 or 8 years ago. But Jay was a genius. He really was, and he's the one that brought in, I think it's Wrigley, the movie director, to do that film. And my complaint with it was only run one time, and that it was very expensive. And I didn't think that actually, you see, the thing is that actually the ad became better known than Apple. I used to have an old saying, and I used to do it in presentations. The ad won all the awards, but the company went bankrupt. What happened to Apple the following years after that ad ran? they went into a deep dive.
Right.
And Steve left. They almost went out of business. They ended up bringing in the wrong guys to run the company. And Apple went through, 6-7 years of decline. I mean, real big financial decline. And so the ad didn't, it certainly was a great creative piece. It won a lot of awards, but the company didn't get many benefits from it. And you can claim that, well, they showed that it was Apple, and that's true. It did give the highlight of Apple, and Steve continued to do that when he came back. He continued to look for these kind of one-piece messages that he could put out there. But in fact, what built Apple was largely its reputation, and it certainly was on. I mean, Apple was on Time's cover about 6 or 7 times, and it was on most of the business and entertainment magazines constantly. We couldn't keep enough people to do the work for Apple on the demands for people to write articles and get exposure. It really was a phenomenon, and it changed everything.
Right.
Yeah. So, Regis, what was the biggest challenge on your career?
There's probably a couple. One was, for me, it was really being able to manage all the diverse things that I'm interested in. I just to give you some idea, I've been putting together some of my archives. I gave 25 boxes, big cartons of boxes of material to the Computer Museum. I gave over 20 boxes to Stanford University. I have notebooks going back till 1970, detailed notebooks. So all the meetings in Apple, all of the board meetings, all of the management meetings at Intel are in there. Details of all the companies. And those books, I don't know, maybe 200 of them, that we've scanned them. They were part of what I used to do that journal that's there. So it's really continuing to figure out my priorities. And one of these days I should retire.
And Regis, you mentioned a little bit before about the Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And I imagine that you feel part of this history. And do you believe that you were one of the main personalities behind the whole environment that we know today, that is the Silicon Valley?
Well, the San Jose Mercury News picked me as one of those people. As one of the people who made Silicon Valley what it is today. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think a lot of it had to do with just being sort of here so early. There was really the whole thing was just getting started when I arrived. When you think I worked on a transistor, and I wish I could show you a transistor because it's you got to have some idea of what is today. A transistor is a single sort of function device. It's very, very small. It's smaller than your little fingernail. And today, my Apple Watch has 8 billion transistors in it.
Wow.
I started selling single transistors. And when you think about that change to where you can now put all of the information you'd ever want to know on something, the size of your thumbnail, that's pretty spectacular. And that's dramatic technological changes that you don't see, that go on all the time. And it's really, it's on that infrastructure that everything's built on. That keeps growing and keeps getting better and more powerful, faster, smaller, more diverse, and more functional. The output's going to change. Your car is no longer, your bank, by the way, is no longer a bank, because you bank in so many different ways. A little kiosk on the street corner becomes your bank. And your car becomes an information source now. It's a place where you can conduct business as easily as you can anywhere else. So this whole idea of mobility and having everything at your fingertips, all the information you need, no matter where or when you need it, and what you need, or you can search for it and find it. That can happen anywhere, in any place, at any time. That just is so almost miraculous that it's hard to comprehend, particularly if you spend so much of your life in the old world, where you went to the library and got dictionaries. I mean, when I started my company, I hired a librarian, and we kept a dictionary. We had a big library. We had a group of researchers that just did research for ourselves, and and most companies had to do that in order to stay on top of things. I think today, everybody really has a unique opportunity to educate themselves, to broaden their views of the world, strengthen their skills, and improve themselves. And it can happen every day in little ways. It doesn't have to happen in big ways. But, this whole idea of how did I find myself into marketing? As I said, I didn't. It found me. If you prepare yourself constantly, and you don't even know what's preparing you, but from your childhood on, you're prepared for something, and you just have to be ready for it and respond to it when it happens.
Right. So Regis, this is great, because you mentioned about your book Total Access. That's a tremendous book, and I especially now during the pandemic, thanks we have this with us. But you wrote as well in your other book, The Real Time. It's called The Real Time. You mentioned about never satisfied consumer, right? That technology is transforming choice, and choice is transforming the marketplace. So how do you see this applying this concept nowadays with the pandemic that's going on right now at this moment?
Well, all you got to do is look at Amazon for that example. Everybody uses Amazon to get everything. I mean, you get groceries from Amazon, you get your pharmacy from Amazon. There's almost nothing that people don't order from Amazon today. And what they do is they amalgamate all the suppliers. And so it may not be Amazon that's supplying you, but they have amalgamated all of the various suppliers on various subjects. I mean, I used to go to a Nikon store and buy my cameras and lenses and things. Now, essentially, I order them all online. And Amazon, by the way, is a prime dealer for Nikon, and so I get, they have first time releases from Nikon. And let me just quickly go, and I'll try to get this done fast, is how this works. Your supermarket back 25 years ago had about 15,000 different SKUs or items on its shelf. It wasn't limited, but it certainly wasn't as prolific. Along came sort of the Walmarts and others who started adding essentially IT to the formula of how you manage them. And so what they do is you start having scanners and just-in-time delivery. So when you look at a grocery store today, the average grocery store has about 20 to 25,000 different SKUs on its shelf. And now, how do they keep them all current? And well, they monitor which ones are being bought and which ones are not. They essentially order real time. When it gets down to a certain level, it's automatically ordered from the supplier, who takes it directly from their warehouse to the grocery store. So the grocery store doesn't even keep an inventory anymore, or a very small inventory. They don't keep a warehouse. So, what happens is that the whole infrastructure is sort of remade to deal with this real-time world and choice world. So that and essentially what technology does, particularly programmability. Programmability means that you can sort of throw a switch on a machine, and you can change that machine to do something else very quickly. You can rewrite the program. You can add a new EEPROM to it. You can essentially add new programs to things by doing sort of one of those little plug-in memory cards to a device, and it changes its output. It's so phenomenally useful in its diversity, is that you think you can do just about anything with that. So when you start thinking about, Tom Peters said it in his book, by the way, he said, we will soon see the day when diversity costs no more than uniformity. And so, that's essentially what happens today. You don't have to pay for a custom product anymore. You can get the variety you want, and custom variety actually sort of equals customization. So, you have of any particular cereal, you may have 150 different types of cereal on the shelves, and that's choice, and that's your freedom to choose what you like and what you want. It's changed so radically since when I was a kid, when these grocery stores were family owned, and they could only keep on the shelves what they could afford to inventory, and usually it was pretty limited because they were mom and pop shops.
Right. No, that's great.
Oh,
and
yeah.
The world's becoming very dynamic as well. So, yeah. So that's great. So, Regis, I know that you do something that I like to do as well, but I really would like to understand a little bit why you do this. I know that you take notes. You mentioned about your archives as well. So I remember probably 10 years ago, we had this conversation, and you mentioned to me something really interesting, that you take notes and you go back and see the notes as well. And with that, you can start to connect the dots, right? Can you explain a little bit how you do that? How did you learn to do this, and how you do this? Because this is something that really can help people to start to put ideas on paper.
Well, actually, I started it in college. I dare say you could probably take my notebooks from college and publish them. They're really, really well done. I mean, I don't mean that to brag. I mean, I would redo them when I went home. I would write the notes in the classroom and then go home and rewrite them so that they were clear and concise, and I could read them more clearly. So I have a lot of my college textbooks, or notebooks rather, that are still 50, 60, 100 pages of notes. And it's largely, if a subject is fairly complex, which technology is, and you're not as familiar with all the terminology, and you need to refer back to it anyway, then keeping a notebook enables you to do that. It enables you to go back and look at and analyze what the meeting was about, what the subject was about. And this is where they say, ask any questions in meetings, because those questions become important, particularly for people who don't really quite understand or comprehend what the mission and the goals are. You can iterate that stuff in pretty detailed writing, and my notebooks aren't always that clear, but they're fairly clear. And not only that, but I kept a lot of personal stuff in those notebooks. Steve Jobs would call me on the average about once a week, even after I was long overdue work for him. He would call and we'd chat on the phone. And so I would actually take down notes on our conversations. And for example, I have, he called me, this was in 1998, when he first, he went to Apple and he talked to Gil Amelio, who was then the president. And he had just sold them his operating system from Next. And he thought it would give him an entree to go back into Apple. And he said to me, he was really disappointed. He said, they didn't offer me a job. They didn't offer me to do any consulting. He said the whole place is run by PR people. He really felt they didn't really know what they were doing. And so I, fairly long page of notes on that. And then about 4 or 5 months later, he calls me and he says, so what do you think of my new board of directors? So between the one in which they sort of didn't want any of his help to where he took over the company, it was just a matter of months. Now, he didn't have any stock in the company. He didn't own a portion of the company. He basically went in and was able to get the people to agree with him, particularly the right people on the board. There were a couple people on the board who they felt they needed to bring him back in. The company was just about bankrupt. They had 2 weeks left of cash. These are all things he told me. And, when he got sick, he called me. So I have these notes on him. Then I can cross-reference them. I have one of his best friends was a guy named Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell was the CEO. He was on the board of Apple and Google. He was the CEO of Intuit, the software company. And Bill was a close friend of mine. We were both born and raised in Pittsburgh. And we became very, very close friends in the early 80s when he moved out here. So Bill and I would have dinner about once a month, and I would keep notes, storing those. And so he would give me, his perspective on things. And, looking at everybody's perspective, looking at your notes, you really enable you to think through things, come up with better solutions, and to know what you're missing.
That's good. And so, Regis, one question, and this is a curiosity as well, and I'm sure that will help as well the audience. What was the most important advice that you gave to Steve Jobs?
You sort of worked by projects. I think, and I was on all his, I was the only non-employee to be on Apple's executive staff. So I was a member of their management team from 1983 to 1987 or 88. So I sat in all their management meetings every weekend, every Wednesday. And, and people who my company reported to didn't sit on that board. The financial guy didn't sit on that board. And so, I had a perspective that was, that I could help Steve with. I did tell him, a number of times that I felt that he had to change, that he had to grow up. I also gave him a lot of examples of what other companies did. I think one of the things you want to try to transition to people or transmit to people is I had the advantage of working for, literally hundreds of startup companies. When I would go to a meeting at Intel and sit in their management meetings, and then I go over and sit at an Apple management meeting, and I may go up and sit at a Genentech meeting, or I may go and speak to a Sun Microsystems meeting, or and then later on to an IBM meeting. And you begin to see, how various individuals operate, and you also begin to see who you respect for their ability to make good decisions. And so this is one of the things that I felt that I did with Steve was I introduced him to a lot of people that it was outside his sphere. He was a real hippie whenever he started. I mean, the two of them when they came in the scene, they had basically cutoffs on up to their knees. They both had long hair down their back. Steve's was all the way down to his belt. They had beards, and they had Birkenstocks on, no shoes. And so these weren't exactly people that were going to walk in to, Intel and say, hey, I want to work with you. It's not that counts a lot, because people see weird people here all the time, but it's just that they didn't have an equivalent experience in the computer industry to help them make value judgments. And I don't think that happened until after Steve came back. And I think that's why Apple has done so well since then, is that the people before him were basically not out of the computer industry. They were hackers. They were certainly, technically they weren't bad people. They were fairly, they were good people, but they were used to working in, companies that were fairly small, and as I said, they were more hackers than they were computer software engineers. So I think that what changed that for Steve was Pixar. Pixar had a real professional team. These guys most of them were PhDs. They were doing, they all came out of computer sciences. They all were doing, three-dimensional graphics. They were inventing new kinds of machines to make the graphics. So these guys were real geniuses, and creativity. They were geniuses. And so Steve learned from them. I'm sure they learned from him, but I think he saw that these professional people were putting together a company that was going to have staying power. And that's what Steve really wanted with Apple. He wanted to go back in and have it be sustained. He didn't necessarily go in and intend to be there the rest of his life. He intended to go in and see if he could put it on a firm footing so that it could sustain and be valuable for years to come.
Great.
That's great.
Regis, we have a game here at Polaris called The Icebreaker. Can us play?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. When you were a child, what was your biggest dream?
I always felt I would move to California. And that turned out to be serendipity. It's a brief story, but when I was in Philadelphia, I was doing I did a few lectures, even then at a place called St. Joseph's College in Philadelphia. And there was a person there in administration who didn't want me to leave. He wanted me to stay and teach. And I told him, well, I'm being transferred to the West Coast. So he tried to find me a job. He said, I'm going to find you a job before you leave. And so he called the head of marketing at Pepperidge Farms. I don't know if you've heard of that. Pepridge, Pepperidge Farms. It's a well-known cookie. It's a cookie company, and they're sold everywhere in the United States. They're sort of a Nabisco like a company. In any event, I went and I had lunch with the VP of marketing at this company, and after I told him what I was doing, he said to me, you know what? He said, you know what I would do if I were you? And I said, what? He said, I would move to California. He said, you're young. He said, you're just getting started. If you don't like it, come back. He said, but if you have an opportunity to go out there and see what it's like, he said, I would sure do that. And so I think I'd ended up him wanting to do my job and me stay with his. But in any event, his advice was to go to California. Now I did it anyway, but it was kind of nice because it really did set up the California move for me, which changed everything. It is so much different than working for an East Coast company. It is, I worked for Philco for a little bit, and they are very bureaucratic. very hierarchical. If you don't have your stripes, you can't even enter a meeting. It's really antiquated management, and it's still many of those companies are that way.
Awesome. And Regis, one question we always ask our guests in our podcast is a movie and book recommendation. So what would you recommend us?
Oh boy, a movie. God, it's been so long since we've been locked up for 8 months. I sort of like arty movies. I mean, we tend to watch. My wife and I watch a lot of documentaries. We watch a lot of mysteries. We like the Brit Box, which is British mysteries. I'm not. And what books? If you were on live TV, you'd see I am surrounded by about 2,000 volumes of books. So for me to pick one, I like to read some for just pure entertainment. And as for knowledge, I like to read science. I read a lot of science. I like to read world history. I like ancient history. And so I've got books on all of those.
That's great. I really would like to thank you, Regis, for the time together. I'm sure that we learn a lot, and our audience as well will learn a lot, because you are history. You're history in terms of Silicon Valley, marketing, PR, Apple. So, and what I mentioned before, I really had a chance to know you for a long time. I learn a lot with you. All the time that we are together is something that I can apply in my life, in my career.
Great.
So I just would like to thank you for this opportunity.
It was nice meeting all of you, Andre and Conrado. I hope I gave you something worthwhile.
You really did. It was, for me at least, was an opportunity of a lifetime. So thank you ever so much, Regis.
You're welcome.
Yeah, same here. It was great. Thank you very much.
All right, y'all. You'll have a good day.
Thank you, Regis. I really appreciate it.
You too. Bye.